I'm Yana.
And I'm Juliana, and we are co-hosts of Mastery Talks.
In our podcast, we bridge the gap between academic insights and real-world leadership challenges. Have you ever wished you could see the next big disruption coming before it blindsides your business?
Well, that's exactly what Yana and I explore in our next episode with renowned strategy expert Rita McGrath.
Being consistently ranked among top 10 management thinkers by Thinkers 50, she teaches management at Columbia Business School.
She also authored several highly influential business books, including Discovery-Driven Growth, The End of Competitive Advantage, and Seeing Around Corners.
Rita will dive into practical strategies for staying ahead of market shifts and share case studies from the digital transformation of Microsoft to stark downturn of WeWork.
Let's dive into the mindsets and practices that distinguish visionary leaders. Trust us, this is the episode you don't want to miss.
Rita, your work on inflection points couldn't be more relevant. Just look at the rapid technological changes and geopolitical upheavals disrupting every industry today. Leaders everywhere are grappling with how to stay ahead in this landscape where competitive advantages are incredibly short-lived. We're excited to dig into the principles and practices you found that enable leaders to spot those big shifts early on. But first, I'm curious, what sparked your interest in researching how to see around corners in the first place?
Yes, well, the concept of strategic inflection points was introduced, I guess, popularly by Andy Grove back in the 90s. And I struggled with this for many years because, a strategic inflection point, when it arrives, it creates a 10x shift in something that's possible. Right? So 10x faster, 10x cheaper. In the case of AI, maybe it's 10x smarter, but it changes the envelope of constraints within which an organization or a person works. And what I struggled with there was, well, if it comes out of nowhere and, it has this huge impact, well, what do you do with that as a strategist, right? But then what I realized is that many of these things have been burbling along in the background, as trends, as things people think about, as things people talk about, sometimes for decades before they actually crystallize into an inflection point, which can have a big impact. And so the motivation for writing the book was to expand on that idea. And the way I think about it is the way Ernest Hemingway described a scene in one of his novels, From the Sun Also Rises. And one character asks another, well, so how did you go bankrupt? And the response was, well, gradually, and then suddenly. And that's kind of the way that I think inflection points unfold. So my encouragement to leaders is you have to make the time to listen to those weak signals that over time get stronger and that can inform when you actually take action.
Your book vividly shows how inflection points can overturn industry's basic assumptions and rules of the game, often catching incumbents off guard. I'm thinking of Blockbuster Video and how streaming completely upended its business model. What are some other examples you've seen of inflection points completely reshaping the competitive landscape?
Well, clearly, the whole digital in all of its various forms is having just huge ripple effects on everything in the world. I mean, if you think about the devices that we needed to once buy to perform simple actions like recording a soundtrack or lighting a flashlight or taking a picture, or, there's like mountains of former hardware and software that's just no longer necessary. So definitely the digital revolution, software is something every company on the planet is grappling with. Most recently, you've seen a lot of excitement about AI, and I do think it's a big deal. I think it's probably less of an immediate big deal than a longer-term big deal. We always tend to greet these things with way too much hype in the early stages, and then too little understanding in the later stages. So yes, AI, I think, is going to be quite something. But what people don't realize is that the goodness of an AI is only as good as the training data that it's able to be trained on. So if you go from, say, a 60% level of effectiveness and you add double the training sets, it might only bring you up to 65%, right? So the improvement rate starts to slow as the AIs get more and more hungry for data. So I think that's something a lot of people don't understand. Just basically, I think we've seen a lot of shifts in the, call it the democratization of communication, that many more exchanges that used to be just one way are now much more kind of interactive and circular and so forth. So that's changing industries everywhere. One inflection point nobody's talking about, but which I think is likely to happen, is at some stage people are going to question how much money is being spent on these targeted programmatic internet ads. I think it's a bit of a bubble, and when that bubble pops, it's going to have unexpected consequences.
Right. And I don't think we talk enough about it.
Yeah, that's a provocative insight, Rita. The potential reassessment of the value and impact of the targeted ads could indeed shake up digital marketing significantly. And could we talk more about the life cycle of what a typical inflection point looks like? It doesn't happen overnight, right? There are stages in how these disruptive shifts unfold.
Sure. So in the earliest stages, you've got things that are happening sort of below the surface and nobody's paying any attention. And then something will happen that sort of raises the idea above the level of noise. So if I go back to my comment about internet advertising, right now there's plenty of evidence that much of the paid for advertising on the internet is either blocked by ad blockers, consumed by bots, in other words, not real human buyers, isn't actually changing behavior at all, and. So the data are all out there, but nobody's really paying attention to them. So what happens next is then you have something dramatic. So November of 2022, ChatGPT is released, and everybody's going like, oh, wow, this is the next thing, and I need to invest, and I need to get on this, and everybody needs to be moving in this direction. So you get this hype cycle. Then people find out, as they have experience with the phenomena, things aren't changing as quickly as they might have thought. Then there's typically what people over at Gartner call the trough of disillusionment. But out of that sort of early hype and then the kind of declining interest come a few examples of a company or companies that can actually use this new kind of technology. And then you start to see it become more real and embedded in the way things are going. So it tends to be not noticed for a while, then huge amounts of hype, then disillusionment, and then eventually it gets embedded into the fabric of what we're doing.
I definitely see this whole hype cycle happening in AI, right? It's a great example to understand the whole anatomy of inflection points. A key insight from your work is how critical it is to spot inflection points early, because we will still have some time to adapt. But it's easier said than done, right? Leaders so often are consumed with putting out fires in the present that they don't get to lift their heads up to look at the horizon. What advice can you give for leaders to pick up on these weak signals of impending disruption?
Yeah, and is there still a window to jump into AI and take advantage of this inflection point?
It's not too late, right? I think the smart people are experimenting with AI and seeing what it can and can't do and learning about it. What I wouldn't do is bet the company on it at this early stage, because it's just, there's so much it's not capable of doing that we've sort of invented and put up there. It hallucinates. It's only as good as the data upon which they were fed. Some of these large language models have really limited capabilities. And so they still need a fair amount of expertise to figure out what's correct and what's not. In terms of advice for leaders, I think challenge number one is getting this on your agenda. And I mean that very literally. Like, what time are you setting aside to really reflect and think about the future? And a structured way of doing this is I encourage people to think about a series of time zero events, where a time zero event signals the arrival of the inflection point. Then what you do is you work backward. And you'd say, what would have to be true before that event could take place? In other words, what would have to be in place before I could observe the outcomes of this time zero event? And then what you do is you create a small group that watches those indicators, right? That takes the time to say, what's moving in terms of, let's take AI's capability. Are we seeing breakthroughs in usability? Are we seeing breakthroughs in the amount of energy these models consume? Are we seeing new players come in that we hadn't anticipated before? Um, are we seeing use cases that are kind of new? And so you watch those developments, and there's a period, what I call the period of optimal warning, when you've got enough information. So you're not operating in a completely noisy space, but not so much that the outcome's already foregone and you can't really change it.
Yeah, this is precisely the kind of work we were doing in Bill Barnett's strategy course at Stanford. He had us deeply analyze scenarios by questioning what has to be true for each scenario to succeed, which aligns perfectly with your approach of tracing back from a time zero event to understand the necessary precursors for change. Now, many of our listeners are entrepreneurs and innovators in startups. How might the concept of seeing around corners look different for them compared to established companies?
Well, startups typically have fewer resources, especially now. The crazy VC money seems to have sort of woken up and it's now having a hangover. So typically, startups have fewer resources to draw on, so they have less leeway to make a mistake. The good thing about startups, in contrast, is they also don't have a lot of legacy to deal with. So they're not dealing with the pushback from their own organizations. They're not dealing, in most cases, with a lot of politics or administrative overhead, whereas big companies are. I think what startups often forget, and I think this period we've been through where there was just money chasing any idea that claimed to be the next Uber of whatever, which isn't healthy for the startup ecosystem. There's just too much money chasing too many ventures. Ventures that are really not good businesses, getting a lot of funding and sort of squeezing the oxygen out of places. So I think, you have to remember entrepreneurship 101, right? You need a business that's got a true value proposition. You need some way of protecting yourself if competition decides to copy you. You need some kind of credibility with your brand. And then you need to have an economic model that makes sense at some point, right? So yes, you might be making investments early on, but down the road, you need to be able to see a path to profitability. And that advice hasn't changed for generations of entrepreneurs.
Yet, Adam Newman's WeWork didn't follow those basics.
Oh, WeWork is one of my poster children for how not to do this. But it wasn't like. By the way, he was smart as anything. I mean, he didn't put this thing on the public markets, and he didn't lie. There's some entrepreneurs that just tell outright falsehoods. He didn't do that, and his data were open to everybody to see. It's the investors who you kind of have to scratch your head and say, what did they think they were investing in?
Exactly. That's a crucial point.
Just the other day, we were talking about how weird it is that investors are not part of the case, right? Because they were the driving force behind many of the decisions made. But I wanted to get back to the point you made earlier on when you mentioned planning to discover. It's really the essence of what you pioneered with discovery-driven planning over 20 years ago. It was a real breakthrough at the time and influenced so many of the lean startup practices that are now common wisdom. For our listeners who are less familiar with your work, what are the core principles of discovery-driven approach?
So, discovery driven planning had its origins in a series of surprises that I experienced while doing research on corporate flops. These were the big, heavily funded, large initiatives by really good companies that ended up not going anywhere. And so I keep a file in my home office, just right over there. I call it my flops file. And you have to lose your parent. You have to lose your parent company at least $50 million to get into my flops file. That's the bottom. And this is things like the original Euro Disney, TV Cable Week, Federal Express's Zap Mail products, and. And what my colleagues and I started to do was go back and study these cases. And it was surprising. I mean, who knows more about theme parks than Disney? Nobody. And yet they went to Europe and made a mess out of it. And so what we realized was that these failures were all characterized by a very common pattern: untested assumptions taken as facts, very few opportunities for low commitment testing, leaders often under a lot of pressure and personally associated with a given course of action, not an opportunity, but a specific way that that opportunity was going to be met. Big teams up front, lots of money up front, very often a super ambitious deadline, right? And what this all led to was these ventures that turned out to be actually quite uncertain. It led to them being planned the way you would plan a less uncertain, modest product launch, or maybe just a moving of the core into a new geography, let's say. So the difference is the ratio of assumptions that you have to make relative to knowledge that you have. And human beings, honestly, we're terrible at processing assumptions. We forget half of them, right, within a very short period of time. Others get turned into facts in our mind, and then we get all emotionally invested in proving that we were right. It's just bad. So what discovery-driven planning does, it's a systematic way of saying, we're going to develop a plan, and not to show you that we were right. We're going to develop a plan to learn what the right answer is. So you start off by defining success. So if this all worked out, what would that look like? Then you articulate what your unit of business is, and that allows you to create what I call a reverse or upside down income statement. And that's the same working backward idea we've already talked about a little bit, which is what has to be true for this thing to be in place. As you're doing that, you're going to be benchmarking against competition. So does your initial business plan require that you are able to get 200% of the market, right? If that's the case, that's maybe not a viable idea. Let's go on to the next one. As you're doing this, you're going to develop what we call an operations specification, which is how many units of business do you need to sell? How many salespeople? How much phone traffic do you need to generate expressions of interest and so forth? And as you're doing that, you're going to be making assumptions. And what the system suggests is document them, write them down, so that you can go back and say, what have we learned? And then the last and most important piece of the method is to break your monolithic planning process down into pieces, which I call checkpoints. And a checkpoint is a moment in time at which you're going to learn something. So initial customer interviews, or creating a prototype, or doing some ethnographic observation. But the point is, you're going to know how much that checkpoint's going to cost you, and you'll have some idea in advance of what it is you hope to learn. And if you do it that way, there's two wonderful things that happen. The first one is you're limiting your cost, right? You're taking risk out, because at any given step along the way, you know exactly how much you're committed to. And the second thing is you're actually building your learning, right? You're building a learning plan so that anybody else who is interested could see what you spent, could see what you've accomplished, could see where you are.
This is so similar to a natural startup journey and startup thinking, and so unfamiliar to big corporations, right?
Well, I think what happens in big companies is you'll have pockets of people who think this way. But if you think about a typical large company, and I'm talking about the Fortune 500 or Global 2000, the proportion of people who are in the innovation function relative to the rest of the firm are tiny. Right? So they're a relatively small piece of your human capital. And unless you structure your company in a very thoughtful way, the bulk of your people are going to be all about the core business. And that's what they want to drive. And so this insight that you need to do something differently in a high uncertainty situation gets lost.
And I love how in your book you outlined 8 practices for companies to follow in order to spot these weak signals and get information from the edges of their organizations.
Yeah, and this was actually also inspired by Andy Grove. He said, if you wish to know where spring is making itself felt, you must travel to the periphery, because that's where the snow is most exposed. And so the way I talk about that is snow melts, but it melts from the edges. So the metaphor is really meant to say, the news that something's changing does not present itself in a wrapped package, at the conference table in the boardroom, right? It starts bubbling up when somebody says, well, that was a weird conversation. Or, I'm making a delivery to a longtime customer and I notice new competitors in their warehouse, stuff like that. So the practices that I list in the book are, how do you get out to the edges? What are some things that you can do? And so a couple of examples are, as a leader, how do you personally immerse yourself in what's going on with your customers? Do you actually experience what they experience? Or are you so wrapped up in bubble wrap and tended to by minions, right, that you never actually have an authentic customer experience? And CEO hubris, the feeling that I'm above it all and I have all the answers, has been at the root of many, many desperate corporate failures. Another one is how diverse is the team that you're using to think about the external environment. So I'll never forget, I was with a design team in one of these New York sort of tech science fairs, and the design team was people from Google. There's their Sidewalk Labs division, and a bunch of Columbia students. And the idea was that they were going to take all these payphones out of the city of New York. They were all over the city of New York, and they're going to replace them with internet-enabled kiosks, so that anybody could access the internet, could charge their phones, could do them. And I remember looking at the people in the design team and asking, well, how are people going to use these kiosks? What do you see as the use cases? We said, oh, it's going to be great. We're going to look up where the local farmers market, what the times are. They're going to give you directions to the artisanal cheese shop. And if you think about this group of people, right, they were all Ivy League, super educated, really, really skilled. And they thought people on the streets of the city of New York would use these kiosks exactly the way that they would. So they didn't bother to do any testing of this idea, rolled it out, right, starting with Manhattan. And within 48 hours, you had like homeless people setting up living rooms around these things, watching YouTube morning, noon, and night. You had merchants saying these things are a nuisance, get it the hell off my block. You had people watching porn in tourist areas. It was just a disaster. And my hypothesis is if they had had someone on that design team who had a good familiarity with what goes on the streets of the city of New York, they would never have rolled it out the way that they did.
That's a striking example.
They should have had at least one New Yorker.
Moving on to leadership challenges in leading organizations towards future discoveries. I guess balancing strategic direction with empowering your team to experiment is a key challenge here. How do you excel at both day-to-day and future innovations?
Well, I think it takes a willingness to, as we've already discussed, get out to the edges and find out what's really going on. I think keeping your eye on the main prize is really important. Articulating a strategy, being really clear about what are the choices we're making, and being very conscious that there's never a perfect set of choices that's going to please every stakeholder. There are always going to be trade-offs. So you have to be really clear about that. And I think strategic clarity is where a lot of firms get stuck because they don't follow through with the choices that they're making. And so just to take the case of Apple, which is a fabulous company, a big part of many of our lives, and they spent like 5 years and $5 billion on this autonomous vehicle project. But if you read the history of that project, it was a whole series of round robin of different leaders coming in at different times with different concepts of what this could be, different trade-offs, starting from scratch every time. It was just a classic example of not having clarity around the strategy of what this was supposed to be. So I think on the one hand, you need to really work hard on what are the choices I'm very deliberately making. And then on the other hand, you want to be very open to hearing from people who maybe are not normally in touch with you. So David Cote, the former CEO of Honeywell, wrote a great book called Winning Now, Winning Later. And the book is just chock-a-block full of practices like this, right, which help you do that. And he says in his wonderful New England accent, he says, the problem with the long term is eventually it becomes the short term. and he's right? And so some of the practices in his book, for example, is he said, look, if you can just hold the cost, for example, of your support services, so human relations, human resources, in institutional arrangements, HR, IT. If you can hold those functions at a flat cost and grow your top line, by definition, your profitability is going to go up, and you're building a company that's future ready. It's when companies get sloppy and let those things grow up too much without really seeing how they add value to the greater whole that you start to have problems. So it's that kind of balance. So another thing Cody would do in any meeting typically is he would have the youngest person in the room start off with giving their point of view. And of course, in the beginning, this was terrifying for the younger people because they're kind of looking at their bosses and going, what should I say? But as he got more time in his tenure, what they began to realize was very often those younger people had a perspective or had a point of view that was quite different from their more senior counterparts, and that it was really valuable to signal and mean it that he really wanted to hear their perspective.
Rita, as you advise senior executives navigating disruptions, what are some of the biggest mindset shifts that leaders have to make in order to become more future ready?
Well, I think the first one is to recognize that any advantage, any situation you find yourself in is likely to be temporary. And that's a big one because if you think about the field of strategy for years, we've taught people that the thing you want to go after is the sustainable competitive advantage, and you can predict on that the future will be like the past. And I would argue you really can't count on that anymore. So seeing change as the normal thing rather than stability as the normal thing, that's a change. I think going together with that, we also need to get much smarter about stopping things. So when a business, a division, a program has reached sort of its natural end, how do we exit? How do we do that? And how do we do that in a way that doesn't leave behind a trail of widows and orphans and people who've been badly damaged? I think getting smarter about that is good. Another one is resource allocation. And in many conventionally run businesses, it's very common for senior leaders to feel territorial about the businesses that they run. So I run the Acme division of the Boeing Corporation, and therefore I am entitled to the resources that are given to that division. Very few firms basically say, actually, no, you're not entitled to it. We're going to budget by program rather than by unit. And we're going to budget along the lines of where our best opportunities are rather than what we've historically done. So there's a lot of mindset shifts around how do you get yourself even ready to make some of these more substantial business shifts.
Talking about organizations and leaders who are doing this really well, can you share more about how Satya Nadella's leadership at Microsoft has been a masterclass in sensing and seizing inflection points? You mentioned it in your book. We can now see the results of it, particularly in the field of AI. Can you share how has he reoriented the company to basically become the leader in the space?
Yeah, so this is actually a phenomenon that I've been really intrigued by because Nadella is one of a rare class of people who you can think of as insider outsiders. So he's a long time career with Microsoft. He's been with Microsoft for decades. So it wasn't like he was hired from the outside, but he was never in any of the big business units, right? He was never in Windows, he was never in Office, he was never in any of the sort of legacy money-making divisions. He was in the cloud and Azure and all those kinds of things, which to Steve Ballmer's credit, Ballmer funded that. Ballmer got them going on the cloud. And so what Nadella was able to do, and I think this is rare, but what he was able to do was use his knowledge of what was best about Microsoft and recognize that even within the company, they had this already built platform that they could really use to grow into the future. So he made a bunch of very bold moves. He got rid of the phone business, just wrote off $7 billion worth of investment that had been made to try to claw Microsoft's way back into the phone business. He just said that ship has sailed. Got people focused on leading indicators, got people focused on what the future would be like, changed the culture, right? Sort of saying, instead of being internally competitive, let's go to the world as one Microsoft. And let's support each other. We got rid of stacking rankings, those kinds of things that were really getting in the way of collaboration and competition. So I think there's a lot of very subtle things, but I think this notion of being an insider-outsider is kind of an intriguing one.
Yeah, I think as someone who lived through Microsoft's last decade as an employee, Nadella's impact is astounding. You have this tech titan that completely missed mobile and social. Now they're beating Amazon and Google in their race for AI supremacy. I mean, that's cool. Okay, now for our listeners who are change agents in their companies, who'd love to have that kind of impact there, even on a smaller scale. What Nadella's inspired moves can they start making to put your principles into practice?
Well, I think you start with where you are, right? And so, okay, maybe you're not the CEO of a megalithic corporation, but typically you're able to influence teams. You have a circle of people in your network that you can influence. And there's absolutely no reason you can't create a network which itself could have disproportionate power. So I'll give you an example. Just last week, I joined together with the people at Eruditus through their emeritus arm and a company called Mentora Institute. And we convened this group of about 50 chief human resource officers from major companies, Chewy and MetLife and big companies. So they're pivotal people in a pivotal position in those large organizations. And we spent a day really thinking about what does the human future of work look like? And so what we've got now is, over the course of that day, we've got a whole group of people who themselves have influence, who themselves have impact. And if we decide there are some important ideas that we want coming out of that conversation, this group is like ready to accept them. This is also a group we're going to look to do some experiments, to do some trial and error testing, because a lot of these new things about the future of work, there's no research behind them. They're new hypotheses, right? And so I think we've got to do some testing. One idea that did come out of that group that I think is quite interesting was raised by Keith Ferrazzi. So he's got a new book coming out called Never Lead Alone. It's about this concept he calls teaming. And he said, when we were in pre-pandemic mode, on a scale of 1 to 5, the quality of the teaming that was done in most companies that they surveyed, and they surveyed thousands of people, was at a level of about 2.8. So 2.8 out of 5. So not horrible, but not great. And that's what he calls the level that you get when you rely on just serendipitous bonding. Right? You're not making a deliberate choice of architecting the team's experience so that they can connect. Now, during the pandemic, that dropped down to 2.3. And his view would be that a lot of leaders saw that drop and panicked and said, "Oh, we've got to get everybody back in the office." But the missing ingredient is it's not just the fact that we're in the office that creates bonding. It's if you deliberately try to create bonding experiences among your team members, you can get up to the 4s and much closer to 5s when you do that very constructively. So to me, this whole back to the office thing, when it's being forced on people, is just misguided.
As we step back and reflect on our conversation today, it jumps out to me just how crucial leadership is. It's a common thread when we look at organizations who are successfully navigate disruptive change. But most management training these days is geared towards preserving and optimizing existing business. What has to change? What skills are the most important and crucial for leaders to navigate the future?
Yeah, I can agree that business education is focused on the leaders who optimize the existing operations.
And today's incredibly fast changing world demands a new playbook for leading for uncertainty. In your view, what are the most crucial skills and qualities that future ready leaders have to foster?
Well, I think here I'll lean on Hitendra Wadhwa's work, which I think is very good. And what he talks about is he said, we often think of leadership as a collection of traits, right? So good leaders are fill in blank. They're assertive, they listen, they're curious, they're humble, they're this, they're that, they're the other thing. And the reality is that leaders need to be, as he would put it, everything and its complete opposite at all times. So he makes a distinction between the core values that you hold. And if you think about a lot of spiritual traditions, for example, or a lot of historical views of leadership, there's this talk about having a centered inner core, you can think of it as. So who are you really deep down? What do you truly believe in? What are the things that motivate you? What are the causes you care about? What are the energies that get you out of bed in the morning? And then your expression of that inner core in a specific situation is going to be very different depending on what the situation calls for. So, for example, if you're in a situation which is very frightening and very sudden and very emotional, right, you may want to give in to those emotions. But as the leader, you may say, wait a minute, what this situation calls for right now is calm. It's taking a breath, it's taking perspective, it's telling those around you, look, we don't know what the answer is yet. We'll get there. I have faith that we will. But just for right now, here's what I want you to focus on. So being able to overcome your own in the moment emotions and think about what does this moment really require of me. And I think, in many ways, when we talk about leadership, I think we've gone way too far on the, bring your authentic self to work and, be truly honest about what you're feeling. I mean, sometimes that's not what the people you're leading need, right? If you've got a team that's just been through a setback and they're discouraged and, they're kind of down in the dumps, they don't need you coming in and saying, oh, yeah, that was real crap. I feel really bad. And just wallowing, right? That's not what they need. What they need is, look, that was a setback. That was a bump in the road. I believe in you. I believe in your team. I know that we can get back on track. And I have complete faith that you are the team to do this. They need it to be and uplifted. They need to be filled with sympathy, even if that's not how you're feeling. So I think as a leader, one of the challenges is you have to learn to, in some cases, And it's not being inauthentic, right? It's responding to what the moment really calls for from you. And just on the master's program preparation, I mean, I think it's very telling that we call the thing the MBA, the Master of Business Administration. We don't call it the MBL, the Master of Business Leadership.
And for most leaders who are my role models, one thing that unites them all is this ability to stay calm and composed in reaction to stress, in the face of uncertainty, and moreover, make their teams believe in a better outcome.
And be able to instill this calmness no matter what, right?
Right. I really love this point.
There is an empowering message that runs throughout your book that inflection points aren't just these random bolts from the blue, that if we're alert to these signals and actively scout the edges, we can gain foresight. And if we reframe, reimagine, reinvent, we can actually turn these shifts into huge opportunities. Given this perspective, how should leaders effectively prepare for these potential futures?
What you want is this gets back to your resource allocation, right? So let's say I'm in the business of telecommunication or voice to or remote communication, something like that, and you ask yourself, well, what comes after Zoom? Well, I don't know. We don't know. It could be many things, right? It could be holograms, it could be headsets that we wear and we're all avatars. It could be touchable screens, it could be haptic systems. Maybe we're having little robots that touch each other in miniature. I mean, I have no idea. But if I'm a leader and I think that I want to consider preparing my company for various of those possibilities, what I want to be placing is options. I want to be making small options bets on future possibilities, knowing full well most of them are not going to work out. And that works out for high uncertainty situations. Now, as you reduce uncertainty and you get more clear about what you're doing, then obviously a different sort of disciplines comes into being.
And the one thing that really inspired us is that inflection points don't just happen to us, right? If we are able to spot them early, if we are putting systems in place to identify signals, if we are strategic about it, we can foresee inflection points. We have agency to act on them.
Yeah, I mean, there's a wonderful example of a Korean finance app called Toss, where their founder CEO saw this gap in the market for Korean language, just financial applications, and has created this company that embodies what I call the permissionless ethos, which is people are allowed to make decisions as close to the edges as possible. People are allowed to make choices to better serve their customers, and he's been very successful at building up this company. And it's fascinating to me that the people in the company were so committed to each other and to their firm that when the Korean government basically said nobody's to come into the office, everybody should stay home during the pandemic, they actually met secretly in like hotel rooms so that they could carry on their work.
Rita, this has been such a thought-provoking discussion and empowering look at what it takes to discover the future in the face of accelerating change. I know I'll be reflecting on this conversation for a long time. And as we're wrapping up, what message do you want to leave our listeners with? If there is one big idea you hope people take away from your work, what would it be?
Well, I think the message is that there's a lot to be hopeful about. Bad news tends to travel fast, and bad news gets our attention, and bad news tugs on our emotions and all that. But what it also does is it crowds out the reality. There's lots of really good news out there, and I'm an optimist, so I tend to encourage people to really focus on the bright spots because there are lots of them. And the big message, I think, from a lot of my work is that you really want to be mindful about managing your agenda. And when I say agenda, I mean that incredibly literally, right? As a leader, as a partner, as a human being, you've only got your own time. And that's the most significant asset to manage. So if you think something's important for your future or the future of your firm, it should be item number 1, 2, or 3 on every agenda, at every meeting. It should be what you're spending the bulk of your time on. And if it isn't, if you're allowing yourself to just get whipsawed by whatever the crisis of the day is, you're never going to have that lasting impact.
I got goosebumps. Thank you so much, Rita.
Thanks again to Rita and to our listeners for joining us on this exploration. Remember, the future is in your hands. So until next time, keep learning to spot those inflection points early on.
Rita's message is loud and clear. In a world of rapid change, we are not just passive observers. We have the power to spot inflection points and seize the opportunities they present.
It's a powerful reminder that the future is not something that happens to us, but something we actively create. Remember that the greatest breakthroughs are rarely come from playing it safe. They emerge when we venture out to the edges, seek diverse perspectives, and place bold bets on the opportunities we discover.
So let's take Rita's words to heart and sharpen our ability to anticipate the future, even if it means going beyond our comfort zone.
Rita has shared a powerful reflection exercise for us. She encourages you to think about 3 to 5 leading indicators that would be really important for you to watch in your industry or field.
For example, in the case of AI, one leading indicator could be identifying use cases where AI is doing something substantial. Where are those things coming up and who's finding them?
Or in the case of the environment, where are we seeing success stories of people addressing challenges like climate change?
The key is to identify these indicators and then figure out how you're going to watch them. Take a few minutes to reflect on this and share your indicators with us. We'd love to hear what you come up with.
If you want to learn more, get a copy of Rita's book, Seeing Around Corners. We'll put a link in the show notes. And here is some cool news. We are giving away a signed copy to one lucky listener.
To have a chance to win, support us on Patreon. Head over to patreon.com/masterytalks to join our community and get access to exclusive content.
And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to Mastery Talks on your favorite podcast app. That way you'll never miss the episode.
Keep the discussion going and feel free to share your thoughts and questions to us. Just email us at team@masterytalks.com. We'd love to hear from you.
Until next time, stay alert and keep working on your ability to see around corners. The future is yours to be discovered.